Where did you buy those, old man? A pawn shop. The voice was sharp, edged with the casual cruelty of youth and unearned confidence. It sliced through the low murmur of the Academy's grand mess hall, a room built to honor heroes, now repurposed for a moment of casual humiliation. The old man, Silas, didn't flinch. He simply looked down at the small, worn, velvet-lined box that had slipped from his grasp and fallen open on the polished marble floor. Inside, nestled on faded satin, lay 3 medals. They did not glitter. They seemed to absorb the light, heavy with a history the gleaming hall could not comprehend. Silas knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, the joints in his back and knees protesting with a quiet ache that had become the soundtrack of his later years. The floor was cold against his worn trousers. Around him, a circle had formed, a ring of crisp, gray cadet uniforms, their wearers a stark contrast to his own frayed janitor's coveralls. The lead cadet, a young man named Kalen with a jawline as sharp as his tone, nudged the box with the toe of his spit-shined boot. "I'm talking to you, Pop. We've got rules here about impersonating soldiers. It's called stolen valor." A few of his friends snickered, the sound echoing unnaturally against the high, vaulted ceilings where the regimental flags of decorated units hung like silent, judging angels. Silas's hand, gnarled and weathered, reached for the box. His fingers brushed against the cool metal of the highest-placed medal, a simple bronze star with a small V device. He said nothing. His silence was a vacuum, and Kalen rushed to fill it with more noise, more arrogance. "Look at this one," he said, squatting down and snatching a medal from its resting place. It was a silver cross, its ribbon a patriotic weave of red, white, and blue. The Distinguished Service Cross. "You expect us to believe you earned this? You? A man who pushes a broom for a living." The other cadets murmured in agreement. They saw only the surface, the stooped shoulders, the threadbare clothes, the tired eyes that seemed to look at something far beyond the walls of their insulated world. They saw a janitor, a fixture, a ghost who polished the brass plaques honoring men they aspired to be, never imagining he could be one of them. The irony was a thick, suffocating blanket they had wrapped around themselves. Silas finally looked up, his gaze meeting Kalen's. His eyes were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and held no anger, no fear. There was only a profound weariness, a sadness that seemed too ancient for the room. "They are not for show," he said, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. It was not a defense, but a simple statement of fact. It held no plea, no justification. That, more than anything, seemed to enrage the young cadet. Kalen stood up, holding the medal between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a dead insect. "Not for show? Then what are they for? To trick some old woman into giving you a free cup of coffee? To feel important for a day?" He dangled it in the air. "This is an insult to every real soldier who ever wore this uniform." The circle of cadets tightened. They were sharks drawn to the scent of perceived weakness, their own insecurities fueling their collective aggression. They were boys playing at being men, and they had found what they believed was a safe target to prove their mettle. The polished floor reflected their smug faces, distorting them into grotesque masks of youthful pride. Silas remained on one knee, his hand still outstretched, not in begging, but in a patient, waiting gesture. He had been in situations far worse than this. He had faced down fear that had a face and a name and carried a rifle. The scorn of children was a different kind of battle, one fought not with weapons, but with a stillness he had cultivated over a lifetime of storms. He simply wanted his property back. He wanted to finish his shift, to return to his small, quiet apartment where the ghosts were his own and did not wear the faces of entitled boys. He had long ago made peace with the fact that his life's loudest moments would be followed by a long, resounding silence. He did not need their belief. He did not need their approval. But the memories enshrined in those pieces of metal were his, and his alone. They were not trophies, they were tombstones. They were promises he had kept to men who could no longer speak. Kalen, misinterpreting this profound calm as defiance, took a step back, holding the medal up to the light. "I think we should turn these over to the commandant. Let him sort out this fantasy." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Silas's face. Not fear for himself, but a deep-seated reluctance to involve the machinery of the institution he quietly served. He had sought anonymity. He had cultivated it like a rare and fragile flower. To be dragged into the light now, under these circumstances, was a violation far deeper than the boy's insults. He slowly got to his feet, his body unfolding with a weary grace. He stood to his full height, which, though stooped, was still taller than the cadet. The janitor's coveralls could not completely hide the broad frame beneath, a frame that had once carried the weight of a nation's hopes on its shoulders. He looked at the boy, then at the medal in his hand, and for a moment, the entire mess hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the old man's next move. The cadet, Kalen, felt a surge of righteous power. He was defending the honor of the institution, of the uniform. He saw himself as a guardian of tradition, confronting a charlatan. His friends behind him were a wall of support, their expressions a mixture of admiration for his boldness and contempt for the old man. "Well," Kalen pressed, his voice dripping with condescension, "are you going to tell us the grand story? Did you single-handedly win a war we've never heard of?" The laughter was louder this time, more confident. It bounced off the portraits of stern-faced generals lining the walls, men whose gazes seemed to follow the unfolding drama with silent disapproval. Silas's eyes drifted to one of those portraits, a painting of General Ridgway, a man he had known not as a portrait, but as a voice on a crackling radio in the dead of night. The memory was a phantom limb, an ache of a time and place these boys could never imagine. He turned his attention back to Kalen. "There is no grand story for you," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Just a debt." The words were cryptic, strange. They didn't fit the narrative Kalen had constructed. A debt? What was this old man talking about? It sounded like the ramblings of a confused mind, further cementing his belief that he was dealing with a fraud. "A debt?" Kalen scoffed. "The only debt here is the one you owe to the real heroes you're impersonating." He took the medal and made a show of examining it again, his thumb rubbing over the inscription. "It's not even a good fake. The engraving is too deep. It was a lie, a guess, but it sounded authoritative." Just then, a figure of intermediate authority appeared, drawn by the commotion. It was Major Heston, an administrative officer whose battlefield was paperwork and whose sharpest weapon was a well-worded memo. He was a man who valued order above all else. He saw a crowd of cadets, a disruption to the dinner schedule, and the source of it all, the elderly janitor. His face hardened into a mask of bureaucratic annoyance. "What is going on here, cadet?" Heston asked, his voice sharp and impatient. Kalen immediately snapped to attention, the medal still pinched in his fingers. "Sir, this man was displaying these trinkets. We believe they are fraudulent military decorations. Stolen valor, sir." Heston's eyes flicked from Kalen's earnest face to Silas's impassive one. He didn't see a hero. He saw a problem. He saw a janitor who had forgotten his place. The calculus was simple. The cadets were the future of the Army, the lifeblood of the Academy. The janitor was just the janitor. "Mr. Ames," Heston said, not even using Silas's first name, his tone dismissive. "I'm sure you have duties to attend to. Please collect your personal effects and refrain from causing a disturbance. This is a place for soldiers, not for storytelling." The word storytelling was laced with contempt. It was a judgment, a verdict delivered without a trial. The institutional weight had just come down on the side of the accusers. Silas felt a familiar resignation settle over him. He had seen this before, in different places, with different men. He had seen how easily judgment is passed by those who have never had to bear its weight. He bent down slowly to pick up the box, his movements precise, betraying no emotion. This was the final humiliation, to be dismissed not just by arrogant children, but by an officer of the institution he had sworn to protect. He was invisible. His past, his sacrifices, were less than nothing, a mere disturbance. As his fingers closed around the wooden box, Kalen held the Distinguished Service Cross out to Major Heston. "Sir, I believe this should be confiscated as evidence." Heston nodded curtly. "Hand it over," Ames a command. An order from an officer to an enlisted man, though Heston didn't realize the truth of that dynamic. For Silas, it was a reflex honed over decades. An order was an order, but this was different. This was not about the mission. This was about his soul. He looked at the medal, then at the major's outstretched hand. He did not move. He simply stood there, a silent, unmovable object. A quiet war was being waged in that mess hall, a war of perception against reality, of arrogance against humility. And for a moment, it seemed humility was about to lose. The major's face began to flush with anger at the insubordination. He was about to repeat his command, his voice certain to be much louder, when another presence made itself known. It wasn't an entrance, it was an arrival. Like a shift in atmospheric pressure, the collective attention of the room was drawn to the grand archway at the far end of the hall. The laughter died. The whispers ceased. The smug expressions on the cadets' faces evaporated, replaced by awe and a healthy dose of fear. Every back straightened, every chin tucked. The air itself seemed to snap to attention. Into the hall walked Major General Croft. He was not a large man, but he occupied a space far greater than his physical form. He was a living legend, the superintendent of the academy, a man whose combat record was the stuff of myth and whose gaze was said to be able to strip a man down to his very soul. He walked with a slight limp, the only visible sign of the 3 wars he had fought in, a quiet testament that his authority had been purchased in blood, not ink. His eyes, a piercing gray, swept across the room, taking in the scene with a practiced, instantaneous assessment. He saw the tableau, the flustered administrative major, the arrogant cadet holding a medal aloft like a prize, and the old, stooped janitor, standing quietly in the center of the storm. Major General Croft moved with a silent, deliberate purpose. His footsteps made almost no sound on the marble, a habit learned in places where noise meant death. He didn't rush. He simply advanced, and the crowd of cadets parted before him like the Red Sea. Major Heston immediately began to stammer. "General, sir, I was just handling a minor disciplinary issue. Nothing that requires your attention." Croft didn't even glance at him. His focus was entirely on the small drama unfolding in the center of the room. His eyes, which had seen the worst of humanity, rested first on Kalen. The cadet felt that gaze like a physical weight, and the medal in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The bravado that had fueled him moments before now felt like a child's foolish posturing. He felt an urgent need to explain himself, to justify his actions to this man he idolized above all others. "Sir," Kalen began, his voice cracking slightly. "This man, this janitor, he was claiming these medals were his. We were simply defending the honor of the uniform." Croft's expression remained unreadable, carved from granite. He said nothing. He let the cadets' words hang in the air, let their self-serving justification wither in the profound silence. He then shifted his gaze from the boy to the old man. He looked at Silas. He saw the worn coveralls, the tired lines on his face, the hands of a man who worked hard. But he saw something else, too. He saw a stillness, a peculiar lack of fear. It was the calm of a man who had been tested by fires far hotter than a cadet's scorn and had not been consumed. It was a posture he recognized, a way of holding oneself when the world was exploding around you. It was the bearing of a soldier, a real one. The general's eyes then dropped to the medal in Kalen's hand. He stopped a few feet away, his presence creating a palpable field of energy. The entire hall was frozen, a tableau of anticipation. Croft's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Cadet," he said, the single word a command for absolute attention. "What is your name?" "Kalen Rowe, sir," the cadet replied, his voice now barely a whisper. "Cadet Rowe," the general continued, his tone dangerously level. "Tell me what you are holding in your hand." Kalen swallowed hard. It's a fake, sir. A replica of the Distinguished Service Cross." He was trying to sound certain, but his conviction was bleeding away under the general's unwavering stare. "A replica," the general repeated, the words flat, devoid of inflection. He took one more step forward, his eyes locked on the piece of metal. "Are you an expert in military decorations, cadet?" "No, sir, but you felt qualified to pass judgment, to conduct a public trial in this hall. Is that correct?" "Sir, You were just what, cadet? Defending honor? Or feeding your own pride?" The questions were not accusations. They were surgical strikes, each one hitting a vital nerve. Kalen paled, his arrogance finally shattering into 1,000 pieces of dawning, horrifying shame. He had no answer. There was no answer. The general then turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon the open box on the floor. He saw the other two medals. His eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. He recognized them all. And he recognized the impossible combination. The odds of one man earning all three were astronomical. It had happened only a handful of times in the nation's history. Most of those men were dead. The others were legends, their names etched into the very soul of the army. He looked back at Silas, and this time, there was a flicker of dawning, earth-shattering recognition in his eyes. He looked at the old man's face, searching the lines and hollows, trying to reconcile the face of a janitor with the ghost of a memory, a name from a classified file he had read years ago. The general slowly extended his own hand, not to Kalen, but toward the medal. "Give it to me, cadet." His voice was barely audible, yet it carried the weight of absolute command. Kalen's hand trembled as he placed the medal into the general's outstretched palm. The general didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He knew its weight, its texture, the story it told. He closed his fingers around it, his grip gentle, reverent. He then turned his full attention back to Silas. The entire room, hundreds of cadets, instructors, and staff, held their collective breath. They were witnessing something profound, a shift in the very fabric of their reality, but they didn't yet understand what it was. They only knew that their world was about to be turned upside down. Major Heston stood frozen, a cold dread creeping up his spine. He had made a terrible mistake, a catastrophic error in judgment. The general looked at Silas, his eyes filled with a dawning awe that was slowly replacing his stern demeanor. He studied the old man's face, the stoop of his shoulders, and then his eyes drifted down to Silas's forearm, where a small patch of worn, faded ink was visible just below the rolled-up sleeve of his coveralls. It was a tattoo, so blurred by time and sun that it was nearly illegible. But General Croft had seen that design before. He had seen it in grainy photographs in after-action reports that were still classified top secret. It was the insignia of a unit that officially didn't exist, a unit of ghosts. Then, the unthinkable happened. Major General Croft, Superintendent of the United States Military Academy, a man who had briefed presidents and commanded armies, straightened his own uniform with a series of crisp, precise tugs. He stood tall, his back ramrod straight. He brought his right hand up to his brow in a slow, deliberate, perfectly executed salute. He did not salute the rank. He did not salute the uniform. He saluted the man in the janitor's coveralls. A collective gasp swept through the hall. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Cadets exchanged bewildered glances. Instructors stared, their mouths agape. Major Heston looked as if he might faint. A major general does not salute a janitor. It was a violation of every protocol, every tradition they had ever known. Yet, it was happening. Croft held the salute, his arms steady as a rock, his eyes locked on Silas. The message was clear, even if the reason was not. This was not an act of pity. This was an act of profound, world-altering respect. Silas, for his part, simply stood there, his weary eyes reflecting the general's posture. He did not return the salute. In his worn coveralls, it would have been a mockery. Instead, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, an understanding that passed between two old soldiers over the heads of the uninitiated. The general finally lowered his hand. He turned to face the stunned assembly, his expression now one of cold, righteous fury. But his voice, when he spoke, was measured, controlled, the voice of a teacher, not a tyrant. "You boys want to know about stolen valor?" he began, his voice resonating in the cavernous space. "Let me tell you what real valor looks like. It doesn't always come in a crisp uniform. It doesn't always announce itself with a loud voice. Sometimes," he said, his gaze sweeping over the cadets before landing back on Silas, "sometimes it comes in the form of a quiet man who has seen and done things you cannot even imagine in your worst nightmares. Things he did so you could have the privilege of standing here today, in this hall, in this uniform, and pass your ignorant judgments." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You see this man," he said, gesturing towards Silas. "You see a janitor. You see someone you think is beneath you. You are fools." He held up the Distinguished Service Cross. Cadet Rowe was right about one thing. This is not a replica. This is the medal awarded to the sole survivor of the assault on Hill 734. An assault where a single platoon was sent to hold off an entire enemy battalion. They were not expected to succeed. They were expected to die, to buy time for the main force to retreat. They held that hill for 3 days. 3 days, against impossible odds. His voice grew quieter, more intense. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found one man still alive, surrounded by the bodies of his comrades and over 200 of the enemy. He was out of ammunition. He was wounded in 7 places. He had been holding them off for the last 4 hours with his rifle butt and a combat knife. The hall was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The cadets were no longer looking at Silas with contempt. They were looking at him with a dawning, horrified awe. Kalen's face was ashen. That man was given this medal, the general continued. But his story doesn't end there. He pointed to the bronze star in the open box. That was for his actions at the Battle of the Black River, where he repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to drag 12 wounded men to safety, one by one, over the course of an entire night. He went back every time. Even after he was shot in the leg then, the general's eyes fell on the 3rd medal, the one that sat at the very top of the box, the one with the simple light blue ribbon adorned with white stars. His voice dropped to a near whisper, filled with a reverence that bordered on holy. And that is the Medal of Honor. A wave of shock, more powerful than the last, rippled through the room. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. It was a sacred object. The men who earned it were not just heroes. They were legends, saints in the military pantheon. Most of you have probably heard the story of the shepherd of Firebase Indigo, the general said, his voice now painting a vivid picture. You've studied it in your military history classes. A small, remote outpost, hopelessly surrounded, cut off from all support. They were about to be overrun, annihilated. Their final transmission was one of defiance, but it was a farewell. And then, silence. He let the story hang in the air. The cadets knew it well. It was a foundational myth of modern warfare. For 6 hours, command heard nothing. They assumed the worst. They were preparing to write off all 120 men stationed there. But then, a new voice came over the radio. A single voice. Calm. Controlled. He wasn't calling for rescue. He was calling in airstrikes. On his own position, the cadets stared, their minds struggling to connect the dots. For the next 2 days, that one man, a sergeant whose name was never officially released, single-handedly coordinated the defense of Firebase Indigo. He moved from foxhole to foxhole, manning machine guns, redistributing ammunition from the fallen, tending to the wounded, and all the while, he was a ghost on the radio, directing air and artillery with terrifying precision. When the relief column finally broke through, they found him, the last man standing, using his own body to shield a wounded private from an incoming mortar round. He had saved every man who was still alive to be saved. The general paused, his eyes glistening. The actions of that sergeant were so extraordinary, so far beyond the call of duty, that his citation is still partly classified. He was awarded the Medal of Honor in a closed ceremony. He refused all promotions, all public recognition. He asked for only one thing, to be allowed to disappear. He said he had seen enough of war. He said the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. The general took a step closer to Silas. He gently rolled up the sleeve of the old man's coveralls a little further, revealing the faded tattoo more clearly. It was a shepherd's crook crossed with a lightning bolt, the insignia of Firebase Indigo's Phantom Support Unit. The army honored his request, the general said, his voice thick with emotion. They erased his name from the public record. They let him walk away. They gave him the silence he craved. He finally turned back to the cadets, his face a mask of profound disappointment. And this is how you repay him? By mocking his sacrifice? By calling him a fraud? He looked directly at Kalen Rowe, whose entire body was shaking. You wanted to see a hero, cadet. You've been standing in the presence of one of the greatest heroes this army has ever produced. You've been polishing the floors he walks on. And you were not worthy to even speak his name. The general then revealed the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. Let me introduce you, he said, his voice ringing with power and clarity. To Command Sergeant Major Silas Reed. The Shepherd of Indigo, the name, spoken aloud in that hall, was like a thunderclap. It was a name whispered in legends, a name synonymous with impossible courage, and it belonged to their janitor. Kalen stared at the old man, at Silas, his mind reeling. The quiet, stooped janitor was a giant. The medals weren't fake. They were relics, holy artifacts of a sacrifice he couldn't possibly comprehend. The shame was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. He had not just been wrong. He had committed a sacrilege. He had desecrated a living monument. The medal he had dropped clattered to the floor, the sound echoing the shattering of his world. The silence that followed the general's revelation was absolute, a vacuum of collective shock and shame. It was heavier than any noise, filled with the unspoken weight of 1,000 apologies that would never be enough. The cadets, who had been a jeering mob moments before, now stood as if turned to stone, their faces a mixture of horror and dawning reverence. They were no longer looking at a janitor. They were looking at a legend, a man who had walked through the fires of hell and returned with a quiet soul. They saw him now, truly saw him for the first time. They saw the strength in his stooped shoulders, a strength that had carried wounded men. They saw the wisdom in his weary eyes, a wisdom earned in the crucible of combat. They saw the dignity in his silence, a dignity that towered over their own noisy arrogance. Major Heston looked like he had aged 10 years in as many minutes. His face was pale, his career flashing before his eyes. He had dismissed this man, this hero, as a nuisance. The weight of his misjudgment was suffocating. General Croft let the silence do its work. He had delivered the lesson. Now it was up to the students to learn it. He walked over and picked up the Distinguished Service Cross from the floor where Kalen had dropped it. He handled it with the care one would afford a sacred object before placing it gently back in its velvet-lined slot in the box. He then looked at Silas, his expression softening. "It is an honor to see you again, Sergeant Major," he said, his voice now quiet, personal. "It has been a long time," Silas simply nodded, his eyes conveying a universe of meaning. There was no triumph in them. No, I told you so. There was only a deep, abiding sorrow. Not for himself, but for the harshness of the lesson, for the arrogance of youth that had to be broken before it could be remade into something stronger. He bent down, his movements still measured and unhurried, and closed the lid of the box. The quiet click of the latch was the only sound in the vast hall. He then turned to leave, his duty done, his anonymity now shattered. But Kalen, his face streaked with tears of shame, stumbled forward. He stood before Silas, unable to meet his eyes, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Sergeant Major," he choked out, the name foreign and wholly on his tongue. "Sir, I am so sorry. There are no words. What I did it was." He couldn't finish. His apology dissolved into a sob of pure, unadulterated remorse. He had committed a sin against the very ideals he claimed to cherish. Silas stopped. He looked at the young, broken cadet. He saw not an enemy, but a child who had made a terrible mistake. He saw himself, so many years ago, a boy filled with more bravado than sense, before the war had burned it all away and replaced it with something quieter, something harder. He reached out his gnarled hand, the same hand that had held a rifle, tended to the wounded, and held the hands of dying friends, and placed it on Kalen's shoulder. The boy flinched, as if expecting a blow. But the touch was gentle, firm. "The weight of the medal," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that was for Kalen alone, "is not in the showing, son. It's in the earning, and in the remembering of those who can't." He gave the shoulder a slight squeeze. "Your war is still to come. Be a better man than you were today. That's all that's asked." It was not forgiveness in words, but it was absolution in spirit. It was a lesson, a final piece of wisdom from a man who had nothing left to prove. He was offering the boy a path to redemption, not through punishment, but through understanding. He was teaching him that honor was not a prize to be displayed, but a burden to be carried with humility and grace. Silas then removed his hand and, without another word, turned and walked away. He moved through the parted sea of cadets, his footsteps echoing softly. He was still just a man in a janitor's uniform, but now, he walked like a king in disguise, his quiet dignity a radiant cloak around him. The cadets watched him go, their eyes following him until he disappeared through the doors at the far end of the hall, leaving behind a silence more profound than any speech. General Croft watched him go, then turned his steely gaze back on the assembled cadets. "Dismissed," he said, the single word of final judgment. "And you will all reflect on what you witnessed here tonight. You will reflect on the nature of honor, of service, and of the respect you owe to every person you meet, regardless of the uniform they wear. For you never know whose presence you are in. The cadets scattered, not with their usual boisterous energy, but in a somber, thoughtful silence. They left the hall a different group of men than the one that had entered. They had come for a meal, and had instead received a lesson that would nourish their souls for a lifetime. Kalen remained, standing alone in the center of the vast, empty room, a boy on the verge of manhood, forever changed by the quiet dignity of an old janitor who was more of a soldier than he could ever hope to be. The polished marble floor reflected his solitary figure, a silent witness to a lesson paid for in blood and delivered in grace.